This is the Thursday, July 20th afternoon session of the Portland City Council. Carla, please call the roll.
Saltzman, Udaly.
Here.
Fritz, Fish.
Here.
Wheeler.
Good afternoon, everyone here. The purpose of council meetings is to do the city's business, including hearing from the community on issues of concern. In order for us to hear from everyone, and give due consideration to the issues before the council, we must endeavor to preserve the order and decorum of these meetings. To make sure that the process is crystal clear, we want to review some of the basic guidelines, which we hope will help everybody be in a position where they feel comfortable, heard, and respected, and safe at the meeting, as well as to ensure that decorum is maintained. Thank you very much. There are two opportunities for public participation. Actually, at this meeting, the opportunities include public testimony for the first reading of reports, resolutions, and ordinances. If you sign up for testimony, your testimony must be relevant to the matter being considered at the time. Please state your name for the record. We don't need your address. If you're a lobbyist, we require that you disclose that. And if you're here representing an organization, it's helpful if you identify the organization you're representing. Individuals have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. Sometimes we have lots and lots of people signed up and we have to shorten it a bit. When you have 30 seconds left, the yellow light's going to light up. When you have no time left, the red light will light up and you'll hear some beeps. Conduct that disrupts the meeting, for example, shouting or interrupting others' testimony or interrupting during council deliberations, is not allowed. People who disrupt the meeting face ejection from the meeting. If there's a disruption, I'll issue a warning that if any further disruption occurs, if you're disrupting the meeting, you'll be subjected to arrest for trespassing. If folks would like to show your support, simple thumbs up is good. If you don't like something, simple thumbs down is good. So with that, we'll get to the first item. I would like to request, Carla, that we pull item 828.
Yes.
Is there any other item that has been pulled from the agenda?
I've had no other requests.
So with that, please call the roll on the remainder of the consent agenda.
We need Commissioner Saltzman.
We need Commissioner Saltzman. Why don't we go to item 828? Please read item 828.
828, extend term of contract with Squire Patton Boggs, U.S. LLP, for federal lobbying.
Elizabeth, would you mind coming forward to talk to us a bit about item 828? The reason I'm polling this, first of all, I think that Squire Patton Boggs has done an outstanding job of representing this city's interests at the federal level. I'm very satisfied with their work, and my personal preference would be to continue the contract. This is an extension of the contract. We are planning on doing a full RFP, is my understanding, but we want to extend this contract during the time which we conduct a full request for proposals to continue our lobbying efforts in DC. My question is one that either has been raised or will be raised, so I'd rather be the one raising it rather than have it be in a newspaper and raised somewhere else. One of their clients is the government of Sudan. Why?
For the record, Elizabeth Edwards, Interim Director of the Office of Government Relations. Mr. Mayor, City Commissioners, as you stated, our current contract is with Squire Patton Boggs. Since, I believe, June, they've had a contract with the government of the Sudan. Under the Obama administration, sanctions were beginning to be lifted. A part of that process is quite lengthy. And so that government enlisted the help of Squire Patton Boggs in making sure that they are abiding by the law, taking the appropriate steps to move through that process, which also includes tracking U.S. currency. It helps with actually fighting terrorism and some of the other efforts that are underway. And it was at the part of the lifting of the sanctions involved former Secretary of State Kerry and former President Carter.
So just to be clear, for the record, the reason that Sudan is on their list of clients isn't that they support the policies and programs of the Sudanese government, which I most certainly do not support. It is to bring them into compliance with the requirement of the United States and other governments around the world that they come into compliance on issues related to human rights and other issues. Is that a fair restatement of their role in this contract?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, much more eloquently stated.
Okay, I appreciate that. Colleagues, any further questions or comments on that point? Very good. Is there any public testimony on this item? Come on up, Mr. Walsh. Yeah, you can have a seat, Elizabeth. Thank you. Is there anybody else who wanted to testify? Seeing none, we'll close the list.
My name is Joe Walsh. I represent Individuals for Justice. Just an observation. I was not going to pull this one. However, the question comes up that if you're going to spend money lobbying the federal government, if that's my understanding of what this is, just on what you have here on the agenda, because I haven't done any research on this at all. But the question went through my mind, if you're going to spend money to lobby the federal government, why don't you just give it to me? Because it's totally wasted. The man that we have in the White House is crazy. You're not going to get anything out of the federal government. You're not going to get anything from the Department of Justice. You're not going to get anything from OSHA. You're not going to get anything from any other department. I mean, for God's sakes, Sessions and Trump are fighting. How bad can it get? Save your money. Save your money for 3 years.
Joe, what's your hourly rate?
I keep trying to get you to give me a raise. It's zero. No matter how you multiply it, it's still zero. I do this because I care, believe it or not. I don't get paid for this. But that's the thought that went across my mind. If you're going to do lobbying, all I'm asking you is watch what happens. It's like me lobbying you. Nothing. Nothing happens. You know? Because the people that you're going to lobby are going to have the same attitude as this council has. It's very arrogant. You know more than everybody else. They know more than you do. So your money is going to go down the tubes. So I'm just asking you, if you're going to spend a lot of money on lobbying, watch what happens. And maybe down the line, 6 months, you just say, this is crazy. Let's pull this money back because these people are all nuts. And we're not going to get anything. We're not going to get any social programs. They're coming after us on a number of items. So it just, that's what went through my mind when I read it. I just said, why would we lobby Trump? And there is no department in the federal bureaucracy anymore. It's all Trump. It's what he wants. And he's crazy. Fancy words I could use, paranoid, all that. No, he's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Save your money. All money. Save all money.
Very good. Thank you. This is a non-emergency first reading. It moves to second reading unless my colleagues have any other questions. I will just say, by the way, lobbying is two-way. It's not only lobbying Washington, D.C. for what we want from them, it's also an opportunity to collect information about what is going on in Washington that could impact the city of Portland. It moves to second reading.
Excuse me, I think this is being referred back to your office, not coming back next
If you'd
meeting.
like to have a further conversation about it, or we can move it to second reading. My question's been answered. Which is what I've done.
Okay.
Thank you. Could you please call the roll on the remainder of the consent agenda?
Yes, Saltzman,
Aye.
Udaly,
Aye.
Fish,
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye, the consent agenda is adopted. Next item, please.
Item 838, authorize an increase in the Chief Procurement Officer's signature authority for contracts that fall under City Code 5.33, 5.34, and 5.68 as a pilot process to expedite city contracts.
Very good. Thank you. And colleagues, I have a number of questions, even though I am bringing this, and I know some of the answers to some of these questions. I do not know all the answers to all of the questions. And conceptually, I think this is a very good idea. This policy has not been updated in many years, and I think it is appropriate for us to review this policy and to update it. Second of all, as many of you know, a great amount of council time is taken up with these contracts, and it's been my observation in 7 months of serving as the mayor that lots come to the council and very few are actually pulled and/or amended. I'd like to have an opportunity just to ask my questions first, and that might spur some further conversation or further questions as we discuss this. So first of all, could you tell me the number of contracts that came to the council in the last year or so between that 100 and 500,000 level?
Mayor Wheeler, just for the record, I'm Ken Rust. I'm the city's chief financial officer and the director of the Bureau of Revenue and Financial Services. With me this afternoon is Larry Palat. He is the interim chief procurement officer, and I think he has that information. I'm going to turn it over to him and have him answer that question for you.
Great.
Thank you, Ken. Good afternoon, commissioners, Mr. Mayor. Boy, I've got a whole list of talking points, and you're kind of cutting in the middle here. I might have to look
Well,
around.
you know what? Go through your talking points, and if you don't answer all the questions, then I'll ask them then. If you have talking points, let's hear them.
Thank you. Okay, so in the last 3 fiscal years, this is tied to the contracting levels. The PTE group, that's a professional services group, they average 310 contracts a year. The average spend for the 3 years has been $30 million. The average contract value was $113,964. Specific data, now this is just the last 18 months. They have done 588 contracts. The total spend is $88 million, and the average contract value has moved up to $149,000. So it's an average annual increase to from 310 contracts to 392 if you took this annualized.
And that's annualized, okay.
That's
great.
annualized,
Okay.
yes, sir. And the contract value increase is $35,000, which is kind of significant when you start at 113. And so where we're at is 21 of the contracts exceeded $500,000. You would have seen those anyway. You have 116 contracts that came in over 100. So what you have is 95 contracts between that $100,000 and $500,000 on the PTE side. So that would be that 95 contracts that would not actually come here to you to spend your time on working on.
So how many of those contracts were either denied or amended? Of
By
the
dollar
95?
value, none.
Zero.
Yes. There have been some minor questions, or Commissioner Fish likes to make a friendly amendment to adjust something in terms of a time frame or something like that. Always appreciated, but as far as dollar value, nothing.
Okay, so if I'm sitting out there and I'm hearing this, I'm like, okay, that's great. The council didn't do anything. But what about transparency?
This is really not so much an issue tied to transparency as it is about workload and efficiencies. Transparency you generally largely comes, let's take BES for an example. They tell you in the budget they're going to spend $20 million on sewer rehab this year. And that's approved in the budget, it's defined, it's there, the dollars are there, they're approved, not approved, changed, whatever it happens. But that's approved. When we bring contracts before you, that's not changing the $20 million, that's not new money, a different allocation. That's money you've already said, yes, we're going to spend it on this type of work. All these contracts are just identifying the specific areas in which we're actually going to do the work. So the transparency is already in place. So for on the PTE side, when the contracts come back, I guess I looked at it a little bit differently. On the $100,000 to $500,000 contracts, those are almost exclusively tied to these sort of routine kind of A&E, architectural engineering type of services. So what happens is if you use a kind of about an 8% calculator, that's kind of roughly what the PTE fees are for a project. at $200,000, that project's going to be a $4 million project. When the construction project is actually identified, that's going to come back here anyway. So you see it on the front end on the budget, on what's done relative to how much did we actually agree we're going to spend. You see it again on the other side when that $4 million project comes back in here and they say, okay, this neighborhood or this area is where we're going to spend this $4 million.
So the contract itself has not been approved, but the expenditure's already been approved through the budget process.
Yes, sir.
So how did you pick, you made a pretty good case, maybe not directly, but you made a case for the $100,000 threshold. You talked about the $119,000, then you talked about the average $149,000. So I get the $100,000 threshold. Tell me more about the $500,000 threshold on the other side. How did you pick that number?
Actually, that number comes to keep us, it's a lot of research. Looking at other sort of similarly sized jurisdictions, nothing, of course, relatively close by except for Seattle. And then I looked at what goes on in Salt Lake City, what goes on in Denver. I looked at Atlanta, and that didn't tell me much of anything. I looked at Chicago, and then, we kind of looked at around similar size, even though those aren't all similar sized cities. And that's pretty low end. Very typically, contracts over $1 million come before some kind of a legislative body. Contracts up to $1 million. And this is, we could pile on a bunch of research, but this is pretty rule of thumb, is that contracts up to $1 million get approved through whatever the contracting office is. Now, a lot of these agencies use decentralized process. The environmental service type people and water people do their own contracts, transportation does their own, that kind of thing. So those are approved inside that agency. They never see the light of, this is a bad term, never see the light of day in terms of in front of a legislative body. And we're not looking at that. We're looking at $500,000 as the very low end and saying, okay, this is something we're routinely doing anyway. There's a lot of stuff that comes here that not much happens.
So you've built a opt-out for the council. This is effectively a pilot project.
Yes, sir.
And at the end of the pilot project, the council gets to decide whether this has been a good exercise or a bad exercise. The public gets to decide whether or not the transparency requirements were met or not met.
Yes.
But when I think of a pilot project, I think of 6 months or a year. I note that this pilot project is 1.5 years. Why the long timeline? Or, in my opinion, a relatively long timeline for a pilot.
The time frame we looked at, because if we enact it now, we basically have, if we go through the end of this calendar year, a 6-month time frame, we won't have enough time to develop a really good, solid, data-driven report for you. If we make it a 1-year pilot, that means it ends essentially middle of our heavy contracting season next year, which is going to be pretty problematic for a lot of bureaus. They've planned on doing things a certain way. They get to June 30 and they have to switch back to the old way.
And I'm sorry, what's the season? How are you describing the contract
Oh, I'm
season?
sorry, that would be basically, for lack of a better term, April 1st to about the middle to late October.
Got it.
That's when our
Okay.
big construction projects are winding up.
So it gives
And
you
then, so-
effectively 6 months after the completion or 5 months after the completion of the season to compile the data, put together a report, come back to the public and the council.
Right.
Got
We
it.
would have a good, solid, data-driven report to give you.
Good. Colin,
Yeah, I have a couple, go ahead.
please, I'm done.
Does this proposed ordinance encompass contract extensions or changes of scope to contracts, current contracts?
Those would follow the rules that they follow now. That piece of the rule would not change. It's difficult to amend a contract to add scope without it coming back to council. Generally speaking, when you add significant scope to a project, you go above the 25% threshold, which automatically comes back to council. So that piece is not changing.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. So the mayor's, I think, first question dealt with transparency. So under our current system, some of these routine contracts that we process show up on the consent agenda, we adopt them, but there's a place where people can go to find them. If we agree with your recommendation here, is there some place on the website or through your website or some other place where people can go to find contracts subject to this pilot that have not come to council but that have been signed off by a bureau director? Just to
No,
give a flavor of this.
I
there's-
understand. I guess I'm trying to think of a cogent answer from the standpoint, all contracts are available.
I understand.
And we aren't changing the solicitation piece, so our electronic procurement system still records all of that.
Well, under our current system, these contracts either show up on our regular agenda or our consent agenda. So you can go
Sure.
to the auditor's office website, you can find the item, click on, get the materials, and it's readily accessible.
Right.
If in the name of efficiency and updating our process, we accept your recommendation, I still think there needs to be a centralized place people can go to find this. Otherwise, we're requiring people to jump through a lot of hoops to find information. And that seems to me different than the efficiency argument that you've raised in terms of how we use our time.
I just want to make one comment. I think it's an interesting question. I just want to remind council that for right now, we have signature authority at a lower level, so there are already a number of contracts that don't come to council at all that are subject to the same, if you think it's difficult to get that information, it's no different than what we're proposing at just simply larger limits. So I understand your point. We have a bit of that already. We also have, after the fact, some reporting tools. We do have the vendor payment checkbook that we created a couple of years ago that gives any individual the opportunity to go online to our website and pull down information about vendors that are receiving payments from the city in almost real-time, monthly updated status. Now, it's not linked to contracts specifically, but there's a lot more vendor information that's present than there was even just a couple of years ago on the city's website in terms of who we're spending our money with.
Fair enough. A couple other questions. One of the issues that we often do focus on when contracts come to council is the equitable contracting numbers.
Yes, sir.
So, I mean, of the issues that come to us, sometimes we're told there's a challenge. Sometimes we look at the equitable contracting numbers. Sometimes we look to see whether the bid came below the good faith, the engineer's estimate,
Right.
Things of that nature. My sense is that the council has spent a lot of time in the last few years looking at the numbers in terms of equitable contracting. So if we follow your recommendation, who's tracking that information?
That information is developed by procurement services now, and there isn't anybody out there that fights harder for more participation than procurement services.
No, I'm not suggesting you don't, but I'm saying that my experience is that's an area that my colleagues tend to focus at. Have we reached our aspirational goal? Have we done better? And sometimes, when we chronically don't reach certain goals, we ask questions about what are the barriers. Other times, when we're well above our goals, we celebrate that fact and we ask what was different. So that has been a valuable part of our contract review process. If we accept your recommendation, what happens to that piece of oversight?
Nothing happens to the piece of oversight from the procurement services type of thing. From the council perspective, individually, commissioners could ask their bureaus to forward them the information is still there, still available. So individual commissioners could ask individual bureaus specifically to a particular project or a type of information if you want to know, okay, in our A&E contracts, where's our participation level in, for example, environmental services? But
So let me ask you this, because we could spend all day on this question, but I just want to, have you reviewed this proposal with Dante James, Office of Equity?
yes,
And what's his position?
he was supportive.
Okay. Why does this have an emergency clause on it?
Solely, and from the legislative aspect, there's only two ways to do this: regular agenda and emergency. And I mean, it would be nice if there was something in the middle that didn't imply risk of life and loss of limb and all of that.
But if we
it
drop
isn't.
the emergency clause for whatever reason, that doesn't put you in any bind today, does it?
As a bind, no, it simply restricts the Bureau's ability to make use of this. This is an efficiency thing.
Right.
And it simply restricts the bureaus from using it for another 6 weeks.
Ken, let me just ask my last question to you. So, a number of years ago, the city's utilities adopted a policy that any contract that was valued at $500,000 or more would be put on the regular agenda. And in fact, the net effect of that is we have a lot more stuff on the regular agenda, and occasionally I've heard from colleagues saying we may be actually overdoing it, but that's the policy, and what it ensures is a higher level of transparency on contracts with the utilities. How does this proposal change that practice?
Well, clearly, we're going to have, if it's approved, we're going to have a different level of contracts coming to you. So whether they are on consent or otherwise, it could affect the number that you would see. I think a little context on this is important as well. We're bringing this action to you not because we're trying to hide anything. That's clearly not the case. We're getting a lot of concern from bureaus about getting projects out the door. We're a central service provider. We have a lot of work. Over the last several years, there's been an explosion in funding resources for bureaus, and they want to get projects out the door. The community wants to see those projects built. BES is spending more money, water is spending more money. We have a housing program that's ramping up. PBOT has more money. Parks has a GO bond measure. So we're under a lot of pressure from our customer bureaus to find ways to do our work more efficiently. This is one of the ideas that we've been looking at that could expedite the time it takes to get projects out the door. Now, it comes with some potential trade-offs. It means that fewer items will come to council. Does that mean they're not going to be looked at? I don't believe that's the case. We've talked about the authority for those projects still will be the same. We still have a lot of review by budget advisory committees, by bureaus themselves. We have our own processes that have been approved by council in terms of the way we're going to contract for, bid for projects. All of that is unchanged. What we're trying to do is find some balance between the volume of activity that we're having, the time it takes to process that activity, and being able to get projects built and out the door and serving the citizens of the city of Portland and making our bureau customers happier. I think if you were to ask bureau customers whether they're supportive of this, they would say yes. We think this is a common sense kind of change that, if structured and executed correctly, will be beneficial to us. And that's why we proposed a pilot period of time to find out, are there things that we're missing that could be improved upon? Are there some reporting things that could be developed that would make people more comfortable about that? But really, it was in response to a lot of demand and concern about how do we get projects done more efficiently. And so what we're trying to do is balance multiple competing ideas here. We think this is a reasonable way to do that. We appreciate the concerns that have been voiced. We have those concerns as well. But we think that a period of time to try this out and see how it works makes sense for the city, given the volume of activity that we have right now and the expectation that that volume is going to stay at a high level for an extended period of time.
Final question. I see that in the ordinance, the thresholds are $500,000 for professional, technical, and expert service contracts and $1 million for goods and services contracts. So
Yes, sir.
the example I gave you of the utilities bringing things on the regular agenda, if this is limited to under $500,000 for PTE contracts, then most of the contracts that I referenced with respect to the utilities would still come to council.
They would.
They would still come to council. So the other question I have is, it's written in terms of the chief procurement officer may execute these contracts. To what extent does your action executing them require some kind of approval or sign-off by the bureau director?
The bureau directors have their own internal processes by which, before the contract shows up in procurement services, to be signed. So different bureaus have different processes, different approval levels on when it finally comes to the chief procurement officer for signature. But by the time it gets to the chief procurement officer, the bureau has approved the contract. They have approved it being submitted, because when the chief procurement officer signs it, it's an executed contract and it's good. You can go start work.
And so at that point, depending on how the commissioner in charge structures his or her bureau, this could be a contract that's been signed off on by the director and by the commissioner in charge.
Yes, sir.
And that is another level of accountability before it goes to the chief procurement officer.
And that would be individual by commissioner and by bureau, how they choose to address them,
And-
yes.
And under this pilot, therefore, nothing would prevent a commissioner from at that point saying, no, on this contract, I would like it to go to council.
Absolutely. A commissioner could absolutely do that.
Okay, thank you.
So
Commissioner Saltzman?
Yeah, I just want to return to contract extensions and changes in scope. So if I understand, under this new rule, if there was a contract, a professional services contract for, I don't know, $450,000, and there was a change of scope or some reason to lead to compensation to exceed 25% of that, that would come back to council?
That comes back to council. That is current practice, and that does not change.
Okay.
It would still come back.
Okay. And I guess, I'm prepared to support this pilot, but I have found over the years that I think, a lot of, particularly consultants, I'm not so much sure it's true in the goods and services, but, consultants fear when the commissioner in charge says, gee, I have to take this to council. That scares them, and they usually come in at a price that avoids that threshold. So I want to just kind of register that concern. I'll be looking at that.
Good. I truly hope you do, because I think that's an effective tool.
Yeah, I think it's an effective tool, too, yes.
Mayor, can I make two comments?
Yeah, certainly.
Number one, you asked about the duration of the pilot, and I share your concern on that, and I wonder, so my first question is whether you believe this should be a shorter period. And second, I want to be very clear, and I'm prepared to support this as well, but I would like to either have this baked into what we're doing or made clear to the bureaus that the accountability piece initially rests with the commissioner in charge and the director to sign off on these contracts and then forward them to the chief procurement officer for signature. And at least with my bureaus, I intend to have that step as an accountability piece within the bureaus. And I don't know whether that has to be requested specifically or whether that's just an existing practice.
That would be policy within the Bureau and the structure that you set up within the Bureau.
So that would have to be just clarified with the procurement.
Within the Bureau.
That procurement services cannot execute a contract unless you get the two signature authorities.
If you wished within your Bureau, and if you communicated it to us, it would be very helpful. If you still want to see construction contracts at between 500,000 and $1 million, and you want a checkoff sheet, tell us, so we would make very certain that, okay, when a BES contract or a water contract comes through, if the commissioner's box isn't checked, we're not going to sign it. We'll send it back to the Bureau and say, hey, there's a box you missed. So get that checked and initialed, and then we'll sign it. We can do that.
And in response to your question of me, Commissioner Fish, I think it's a misnomer to call it a pilot project. This is a policy change with a sunset, but it makes perfect sense given the life cycle of the contract, as you described earlier.
Thank you.
Is there any public testimony on this item?
Yes, we have 3 people signed up. They're Craig Rogers, Joe Walsh, and Floyd Jones.
Is there anybody else who'd like to testify? The list is closed. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Council. My name is Craig Rogers. And let's talk animals. This is kind of an example of the fox guarding the hen house or the camel getting its nose under the tent. And when I hear the phrase data-driven, my caution flag goes up. And as you yourself said, Ted, don't trust the numbers. Remember on the emergency with the data. And I would like to hear more of your thoughts on that because it probably comes from your experience. Don't trust the numbers. So during the street fee, near the end of its life here, before it went down to Salem, the city had hired a consultant who had prior experience as an employee of the city, and they needed to reinstate the contract for a sum of $35,000. Citizens of the city, whose money this is, then had an opportunity to voice their opinion, and I think that's a very important right. It's called the First Amendment. So I think it's important to remind you that when standards fall, trust is right behind. And over a period of 4 years, this city report card, these are historic lows. And I know how they got that that low. In fact, they're kind of so low, you almost need another piece of paper to show how low they are. I think trust should be a priority. And I think communication is the foundation of all good relationships. And quite frankly, it's really hard often to get through. And we had a member of council say, well, I think staff would be delighted to communicate with you, but that's not the fact. We've had a lot of people, and we've both been present in this room, when they come up here for their 3 minutes and they tell you that they tried to talk to staff and they couldn't get through to them. So, I've said before here, I'm watching the death of democracy at the level of Portland City Council. And actually, this is what I'm seeing right now, if you take our voice away on this. But then again, compromise is a wonderful thing. What's the data? If it's to drop down to 100 grand, 150, something, what are the numbers there? It's something to consider. And then in this report here from Osberg, they gave you a D- grade for transparency in city spending. Well, I tend to walk on the sunny side of the street. I'd give you an F+.
Craig, in fairness to the mayor, I think he had another job when that report card came out, but I don't think it's been updated in the last 6 months.
Well, there is a trade-off. And in the light of day, the bureau directors have been very explicit about what the trade-off is. There still is the budget process, and in my view, it is as transparent as a public budget process can be. There's probably improvements that can be made, but on the whole, having looked at the county, having looked at the state, and now having the opportunity to evaluate the city, I think it's actually very good. It's not to say there aren't improvements to be made, but the trade-off that they're specifically calling out today is bringing back hundreds of contracts to the city council. And over the past year, the number that were amended or rejected was 0, against the withering pressure for us to be faster to address the issues of this city. I mean, if you pick up your newspapers today, you will see I am being excoriated broadly for being too slow to respond to the housing crisis. This is exactly the kind of policy change that can help make it efficient and speed things up. So there are trade-offs, but in this case, personally, I think it's a good trade-off. I think it is a risk. There's always risk associated with any policy change. But on balance, I think it's actually I think it's a solid move in the right direction, personally. That's just me. Mr. Walsh, good afternoon.
My name is Joe Walsh. I represent Individuals for Justice. I would ask you for your patience if I go over a little bit. I don't feel well, and I'm struggling with some words. You're talking about 95 contracts, okay, in 17 months. That's what they're talking about. So if you do the math, I'm terrible at this. So, because I round everything off. It's about one contract a meeting, a week. Why is that so much to ask from you? There's not a lot of contracts involved in this. It's tens of millions of dollars that you're going to give away to an administrator. The people of Portland voted you into office to take care of our money. Everything I heard here today, presented by the people that gave you the information, was all about efficiency. Well, there's a guard outside this building. Let's let him sign off on it. That's efficient. They wouldn't even have to bother coming into the building. Just have the guard say, yeah, okay, here's $10 million, go do it. That's efficiency. That's not what you're charged with. You're charged with representing the people's money. That's what your charge is, and you're giving it away for efficiency. I understand you were a treasurer, and it's all about efficiency. Here, it's about, I want you to take care of my money. I want to get up in the morning and say, Mayor Wheeler cares about how he spends money. You were just told by a judge, $17 million. You got to find someplace to give back to the general fund. So with all your stuff that's in place right now that we're asking you not to change, you're on the hook for 17 million. Where you gonna get that? We're asking you, do not change it, or at least do some amendments on this. Shut down, maybe cut it in half, maybe stay, instead of going from 500,000, go to 7,500, or 75,000, or 750,000. Whatever the number is, don't jump from 500,000 to $1 million. Why are you doing that? You guys have a terrible reputation. Why are you doing this? This just adds to it. And that's why we get so frustrated. We walk out this building and just say, God, why did they do that? You know? And it's not going to be on me. It's going to be on you. You know, all of you. It makes no difference to me. I'm not going to be here when this stuff hits the fan. But you got a lot of bills coming up. Don't give away your power.
So just to be clear, we're not.
Yes, you are.
No, you're
it's
wrong.
It's arbitrary.
It is not arbitrary.
I'm going to say to that.
Do you want me to respond to your comment? I'm happy to do it or not,
but
either
tell
way.
the truth.
I will
please.
tell the truth. We have people in our city infrastructure. We have bureau directors, we have deputy bureau directors, we have professionals. All of them go through and vet this entire process. Then we, as commissioners who are in charge of whichever bureaus we're in charge of, are then also responsible for the outcomes of those contracts. And then with the, just a sec, then with the parameters that we have just put into place, certain contracts either do automatically come back to the council or by the request of any one of the 5 of us up here, any contract can come before the council. And what we are balancing here, we're not just saying, hey, go have a party, sign any contract you want. We are simply setting standards for which contracts come back to the council for full council approval. And as you heard, there are multiple checks and
But you lay out
balances.
this wonderful scenario, except there's one piece missing. And that's, it is not mandated that the bureau heads, which you are the bureau heads, are mandated to do that. It's an option. And the bureau head can do it any way they want, because the way we are
I
set
disagree
up
with
in this
that.
city.
No, I fundamentally
read the
disagree with
ordinance.
that.
Read the ordinance, and if I'm wrong, then put in the ordinance that the bureau heads will review these contracts.
They do.
Because we want to hold you responsible.
They sign them.
Not some administrator.
They sign them and we sign them, and then we are held
It's
accountable.
not in there.
Well, that's the way the contracts work, Joe. That is just how they work. Good afternoon.
Oh, yeah, see, now you went Zoom.
How did
now
how
you
did I
just-
go Zoom?
Because it's not in there, it has to be by law. You cannot say to me, because if a contract comes into this city and this administrator signs off on $1 million contract, you may never see it. And that's what I'm
All
saying.
right, well, let's see how it shakes out. We'll see who's
yes,
right.
Let's
Good
gamble with the
afternoon.
people's
You've had your
money.
piece. I've
That's
had
what you're
mine
saying.
responding to you. Good
And
afternoon.
that's what's wrong with this council. You don't listen at all.
You're confusing listening with agreeing with you, and respectfully, sir,
I'm
I
not.
disagree with you.
Lots of
Good
people
afternoon.
disagree with me. Commissioner Fish and I disagree all the time.
Your time is up. Let's hear what she has to
He
say.
does listen, and so do I.
Thank you.
Damn.
Good afternoon.
Good
Thank you for your
afternoon, Mayor and
patience.
Commissioners. My name is Floyd Jones. I'm with Friends of the Reservoirs, and for the benefit of Commissioner Chloe, who I've not had opportunity to speak with, we've been working on Water Bureau issues for 16 years personally. I have at least 16,000 hours related to Water Bureau issues over all these years. It would take the full 3 minutes for me to go through all the background, but I've served on the Water Bureau Budget Committee for multiple years, attended all Budget Committee meetings for at least 7 years, maybe 8 years.
Thank you.
As background, okay. So the reason I'm here is to talk about this procurement change, and we do have the transparency concerns, and it's it sounds to me as if there are Water Bureau contracts ready to go, and that's why the emergency clause. I'll give you an example from 2000, well, I don't know the year, but anyway, the Water Bureau brought a CH2M Hill technical service contract. It was a flexible service contract for water mains. You can read the contract, you can watch the tape, that's what it says. Then subsequently, we found out they used that contract in order to have CH2M Hill do pre-design for UV radiation, which we don't want mercury in our mercury bulbs breaking in our water. And then that set them up a clear advantage, rather, to get the next contract, which they did. And so the issue is, as Commissioner Fish brought up, transparency. When it's on the council agenda, we click on a button, we see what the contract is. We might not have time every single time to come down here to voice any concerns, but we can see it. We know what contracts are out there. We know if we want to go back and ask questions about it, we can. So in this scenario, where would we go to find that information in advance of it being signed? That's a big concern. And transparency all around. I went to the Portland Utility, the new Portland Utility Review Board, and their first issue, and there was consensus on this, is that many complex issues, corrosion control, biogas, of course crypto, that's what they're talking about, hydro, they all come to them, and this is a quote, often it seems as fait accompli, and bottom line says, requested information, is usually not given until the day of the meetings, making their work less meaningful. I went to the wholesale customer meeting last week. They are very upset about not being included in the corrosion control up front. Their exact words were, this could set the whole region into chaos. So, transparency is big for a lot of reasons. Looking at these long lists of contracts, you've all seen my chart, and I know you all hate seeing it, and this only goes to 2011, but these are all the contracts that have gone to MWH Global, CH2M Hill, just up to 2011. There are many, many more. I haven't had time to extend this list here, but transparency is really important. So where is it that we would go to be able to see those contracts? And some of these flexible service contracts will fall into that category.
So, Mayor, can I?
Commissioner Fish, yes.
Thank you for your testimony. Let's excuse the testifiers, and then I'll make a comment. As I read this ordinance, Mayor, it says that if the chief procurement officer may execute professional, technical, and expert service contracts that do not exceed $500,000.
That's correct.
Contracts in excess of $500,000 for PTE, which is what Ms. Jones was referring to, would still come to council.
That's correct.
Okay. And second, as someone who was actually present for part of the pub and has been involved in discussion in a number of these water-related issues, I deeply respect Floyd Jones's service to the city and the dogged way in which she follows these issues, but she just made a number of factually incorrect statements, and we don't have the time to sort of go back and hit the truth button, but it's grossly unfair to make those kinds of comments and representations that aren't factual. And if my colleagues would like to have any follow-up on a number of the things she said, I'd be happy to share the actual factual.
Well, I have sort of a different, I'm actually very satisfied with this policy. To the degree that there are people out there who want to work with me and who would commit the time and the energy that is required to review contracts on a timely basis. Because as you know, the number one standard that we're being held here, which is solving the problems of our community and making it a better place to live, that is actually the value. This is where I disagree a little bit with Mr. Walsh. I agree that maybe in my role as state treasurer, there was more of a focus on ROI and that kind of thing, efficiency, but that was a different job. The goal here is a values-driven proposition around making the community a better place by addressing issues like the housing and the homelessness issue, policing issues and whatnot. And there's a timeliness aspect to this. And what I hear from the public is they both want us to be transparent and accountable and cost-effective and quick. So there's something of a balancing act that we're engaged in here. And I think this ordinance does a really good job of capturing that balance. But if there's people who are really, really into the contracts that I sign in my bureaus, I'm not afraid to have people come in and review those contracts. I just can't wait 2 months for people to do it. nor can I wait endlessly to respond to the crises of this community. But if there's people listening and you really want to review contracts to the degree that we're able to accommodate that, great. I'm all for it.
Mayor, if I
Yes,
had,
sir.
if I had the time, I'd volunteer. So
Perfect.
let me.
I'll put you on the list.
Let me, I'd like to just, this is not in the nature of a friendly amendment, I think it's just a clarification. The ordinance contemplates that the council will get a report at the end of the pilot period, and it specifies sort of general categories of information. Mayor, my request would be that at the time in which the chief procurement officer begins to think about a report, that we each get an email outlining the intended scope of the report and the issues to be discussed for feedback, so that we can help shape what kind of information we'd like to get back. in
You're
that
getting
report.
2 head nods, Commissioner Fish. That's a go.
Yeah, I
Good.
don't think this is the time and place to put every single feature, but if you would scope that report with the council before you actually undertake it, I think that would be beneficial.
Great. Further comments? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Saltzman,
Well, this has been a good discussion. I appreciate the testimony as well as the discussion amongst my colleagues. It is a dry topic, but it's an important topic, how we spend your money. I do think that maybe a little bit lost in all this is procurement services is a body that's independent of the bureaus. And I think they're charged with being autonomous and applying a certain amount of criteria and asking tough questions of contracts that come out of the bureaus. And I do think that that's something that we sort of have maybe been glossed over in this discussion. I am willing to undertake this for a couple years. I am somewhat, and I say that as somewhat of a micromanager. I do like to, and I do sign every contract under every bureau that I've ever overseen. My signature's on that contract, as I'm sure is the case with my colleagues. But I think it's worth, given the booming climate we're in, and given our bureaus have a lot of work to do to fulfill public needs, I think this is worth undertaking this, not pilot, but program for 2 years with a sunset clause. Aye.
you Daly.
I had some concerns about this ordinance, but I appreciate all the conversation and questions that were answered today. It makes sense to me. We haven't adjusted the signature authority in 20 years. A lot has changed. And the fact that there's a sunset on this and we're going to receive a report is reassuring to me. Aye.
Fish,
Yeah, I think this has been a good discussion. I think the reason we keep calling it a pilot is because the word pilot appears in the ordinance, so it's true. It's a subliminal thing, but, and I appreciate the concern people have raised about how we balance transparency and efficiency, but I'm persuaded that this is worth experimenting with, and particularly because the PTE threshold is set at 500,000, it doesn't change the existing practice with the utilities of bringing those contracts to council, and we will continue to do so on the regular agenda. So thank you to Procurement Services and the mayor for bringing this forward. Aye.
Wheeler,
I loved this conversation today. Obviously, not all of us agreed on all points, but I actually appreciate it. I appreciated the back and the forth, and I think the discussion/debate helped highlight the trade-offs that are inherent in this policy. And so frankly, I really enjoyed that. I hope we have continued robust discussions and even disagreements in this chamber. I think it's a good right sizing. I think it's a good course correction given the changes that have taken place over the years. And I really appreciate the work that the bureaus have done to come up with what I think is a very good common sense approach that takes into account a lot of different balanced and sometimes competing needs. So I think you hit the balance largely right, and I'll look forward to seeing how this unfolds in the months ahead. Aye, the ordinance is adopted. Next item, please.
839, approve application under the multiple unit limited tax exemption program for church apartments located at 8432 North Syracuse Street.
So, colleagues, this is one of many innovative programs that the city has to address housing affordability in the city of Portland. These programs are complementary to the recent voter-approved housing bond and aligns with the goal of increasing the supply of affordable housing. In other words, the city has many different programs and policies at our disposal many of which have received the intense attention of my administration over the last 7 months. This is just one of many. The Multiple Unite Limited Tax Exemption Multi-Program is one of the important tools to promote mixed-income rental housing that would otherwise be available only at market rates. Portland's market, as everybody understands, is experiencing very low vacancy rates, and the multi-program provides a crucial incentive to develop affordable housing units. The Church Apartments is just the latest project to come before the council for approval of a multi. The council has approved 20 projects over the last year and a half, which is projected to result in over 400 affordable housing units becoming available in the next couple of years. To discuss this particular program at the Church Apartments, we have representatives of the Housing Bureau, including Director Krieger, if you wanted to start us off, sir.
Thank you very much, Mayor Wheeler, members of council. Kurt Krieger, Housing Director. I'm pleased here today to introduce Dory Van Bonkel, who is the chief staff in charge of this program. And I would underscore that we're entrusted not only by you, the City Council, but also by the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners to administer this tax abatement program. It was designed as a means by which to tap the hydraulics of the private market and the private sector to incentivize them to provide affordable housing that would otherwise not be made available. So it's done in cooperation with private developers using their own capital. And Dory is that single point of contact that helps them understand the program and helps them work through the obligations and the commitments that go with the program. So with that, I'll let Dory explain the Church Street Apartments and the specific developer.
Good afternoon, Dory Van Bonkel with the Housing Bureau.
Good afternoon.
And so this is actually a developer who has submitted a couple of other applications that have been approved for the multi previously. This particular project is in the St. John's Cathedral Park neighborhood and is a smaller one for the program in that there's 22 total units resulting in 5 units of housing affordable at the 60% of area median income level. And still will result in a reduction of rents by an average about $400 or $500 per unit for those affordable units over the 10-year period of the tax exemption.
The other thing that I would mention is that this program was refined under the sponsorship and tutelage of Commissioner Salzman and made more useful and streamlined for the private partners. So the projects that you will see, including the Church Street Apartments and the remaining few coming forward, are those that were created and authorized under the former multiple unit tax exemption program. On a going forward basis, you're likely to see more projects that are complying with your inclusionary housing policy, and the tax abatement is one of the offsets among many others that are offered to private developers. The biggest difference is that we're going from 20 years of affordability, 10 years of affordability under the current model to 99 years of affordability going forward. I was never particularly comfortable with buying temporary affordability because in 10 years we could still have a different kind of housing problem. So the longer term affordability is quite important. There are some equitable contracting responsibilities that come with this money. Could you explain that, Dory?
Yes, in order to reach towards the goal of 20% participation in the construction contracting by minority women and emerging small businesses, we do have the developers contract with a third-party technical assistance provider who can provide feedback, help with bidding processes, et cetera, in order to reach towards that goal. Look at what plans they have, the steps that they take and will take in order to hopefully reach that outcome. And it's been a short term that we've had that in place over the last year and a half or so. And what we've been able to do is see some positive outcomes from it, but more than anything, also use it as a learning experience. And so that's one of the requirements of this voluntary multi-program that's been in place, that we have seen some success, at least in the relationships forged between the particularly minority contracting community and some of the local developers.
Kirk, Mr. Director, I was pleased that you mentioned Commissioner Saltzman's reforms of this program, and I might quarrel with you about, quote, making it more useful, but I think the signature achievement was convincing the county to lift the cap. Because as you know, we had a hard cap, and with a hard cap, there were fewer people eligible. So whether it was a competitive process that, or not, whether it was streamlined or not, the bottom line is we got fewer projects that were covered. I think that was important. I also, just because I like history, I will remind my colleagues that in 2008, the auditor issued a blistering audit of our tax abatement programs. And out of that came a series of council actions to address the concerns the auditor raised. One was about transparency, and one was about ongoing oversight and accountability. And there were some structural issues. As a result of that, Mayor and colleagues, the program migrated from the Portland Development Commission to the Portland Housing Bureau. Portland Housing Bureau was required to give no less than annual reports to the council. We now have a routine procedure where we get a report and certain projects are delisted and disqualified because of failure to follow the criteria. And that money then comes back to the county and to the city. And in addition to those changes, under Dan's watch, we addressed some concerns that developers had that it was cumbersome. We eliminated the competitive process and we lifted the cap. So that's a lot that's happened since 2008. I also want to acknowledge, although it doesn't get the same attention, that the Bureau now routinely puts an impact statement with these requests. So we actually have a slide that shows us exactly what we're buying and what 60% of AMI looks like and who benefits. So a lot of progress around transparency and accountability. It still is not my favorite tool because it's not addressing the acute problem in our community. But if we're looking at a toolkit that has many tools and allows us to do many different things, it's the best tool we have for this purpose. And I continue to have a concern that we're really not focusing on where the greatest need is. This particular tool is not geared to get us there. And so we either accept the limitations of this tool and get some units spread around the community in nice buildings, or we don't. That's a fundamental policy question. And as we currently stand, the city and the county both think that this is a good investment, so I will go along with it. But appreciate the work of the Bureau in improving public trust in these programs through the oversight work you do.
The only other thing I'd like to mention is that in 2016, the City Council enacted the North-Northeast Preference Policy. And it was decided that every project that the Bureau is funding directly or indirectly in North and Northeast Portland would abide by the preference policy itself. So even though we're not directly financing these units, the developer will participate in the preference policy and will be using the no-app fee platform as a means by which to fill vacancies, which also creates a relationship between the private developer and the Tyrone Pools organization, so that on a going forward basis, if they have other properties elsewhere in the city, they might choose to use that platform as a way to fill vacancies. It's very important that we match the people that need the housing, because we're always getting the question about where are these and how do I get on a waiting list. And in this particular instance, because it's in North and Northeast Portland, the path to return that was created by council in that policy would apply to these units.
Very good. Colleagues, any further questions? Do we have public testimony on this item?
No one signed up.
Very good. Please call the roll.
Saltzman,
Thank you, Dory and Kurt, for your good work, and this is a great project, and I'm happy to support it. Aye.
Udaly,
Aye.
Fish,
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The ordinance is adopted. Thank you. Next item, please.
840, authorize a temporary easement from PS Oregon, Inc. for the Tryon Creek Headwaters Project number E10582 in the amount of $3,000.
Commissioner Fish.
Mayor, in light of the action the council just took on 838, I think this has been resolved, we can move forward. No, I just, an attempt at humor, a long
I
day.
thought it was good. It was pretty good.
We're joined by Scott Gibson and Jim Brown. Scott, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, City Council.
Good afternoon.
The purpose of this legislation is to authorize the Director of the Bureau of Environmental Services or their designee to execute a temporary easement with PS Oregon, that's Public Storage Oregon, in support of the Tryon Creek Wastewater Treatment Plant Headworks project. A temporary easement is required for the city's consulting team to perform investigations necessary for the design and permitting of the project. Following the site investigations and site design, BES will be able to determine the extent of the property acquisition from Public Storage Oregon required for the project. Public Storage Oregon's attorney requires inclusion of an indemnification clause to finalize a temporary easement. This clause holds BES responsible for claims, damages, and fines levied as a result of the site investigations. Council's authorization is required for indemnification provisions in the proposed temporary easement. Both Jim and I are here to answer any questions you may have about the easement or about the project.
Colleagues, Commissioner Udaly? Nope. And there you have it. Is there
Thank
any
you.
public testimony on this item?
No one signed up.
Please call the roll.
Saltzman,
Aye.
Udaly,
Aye.
Fish,
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye, the ordinance is adopted. Next item, please.
Item 841, authorize an intergovernmental agreement with Energy Northwest in the amount of $8 million for the operations and maintenance of Portland Hydroelectric Project.
Commissioner Fish.
Mayor, thank you. We have had a previous hearing on this matter, and subsequent to that hearing, I have received a number of questions from colleagues and third parties, and I thought, Mayor, that before we take action on this, I thought it would be helpful to have a supplemental presentation to give the council as full a picture as possible about what we're asking you to do, what we're not asking you to do, and answer any questions that come up. And I've asked the director and one of our ace attorneys, Karen Monahan, to join us today. Karen, I think I'm going to turn it over to you first, or Mike?
Me.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to the director, and then we'll turn it over to Karen. Welcome.
Mr. Mayor, Commissioners, thank you for taking time to talk to us today. We're here to talk about the agenda item and Energy Northwest. This is a very complicated issue, and we had hoped initially to be able to bring all parts of this thing together at once. But we negotiated with PGE for almost 15 months. It was tough negotiations, and we just weren't able to finish lining this up. I think that you'll be pleased with the result that we achieve, and we'll be back on August 16th to talk about the power sales agreement and the other two parts. The reason we're here today is we really need to let this maintenance contract go. We are obligated under our FERC license to properly operate and maintain the facility, and PGE's contract is up on 30 August. So we need to get our new maintenance contractor time to hire and be able to operate. As I mentioned, this is a very complicated thing. We've been helped by a technical firm that's an expert in energy policy and marketing, Energy GPS. Ken Kaufman is a specialty attorney in power and power agreements that Tracy Reeve found for us to use in doing this negotiation. We've consulted extensively with Ken Rust, our CFO. He will help us present on August 16th to go through the financial issues. Cecilia Hune, whom you know, Karen, our lawyer, Dave Peters, and Glenn Pratt have been managing the effort for us. So on that basis, I'll turn it over to Karen.
But before you do this, and I apologize, and I don't want to seem daft, but I've not been completely in the loop on this issue. Could you clarify the steps you are asking the council to take? And I realize at a broad level, you just did. But I want to make sure I understand exactly what you are asking for in the order. Commissioner Fish, just so I have it perfectly clear.
We are going to lay that out. Karen is about to lay that out in excruciating detail.
Okay,
and
fabulous.
she'll take any questions you have, but
Hopefully not too excruciating.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't the presentation.
No.
Because,
No.
good.
Karen will elaborate.
She's channeling your anxiety on this, and she's going to answer that question.
Fantastic, thank you.
Good
Good
af-
afternoon, thanks for being here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Karen Moynihan, and I'm a Senior Deputy City Attorney assigned to advise the city on matters related to the Portland Water Bureau. I'm here today to discuss the proposed intergovernmental agreement with Energy Northwest to operate and maintain the Portland Hydroelectric Project. I will address 3 questions. First, why are you being asked to approve this IGA prior to other documents related to the project? Second, why is it important to approve this IGA? And third, does your action today affect the city's general fund? Over the past 35 years, the city has invested $55 million in this project. Net of cost, including paying down the project's debts, has returned $14 million in profit to the general fund, and there is a reserve fund of $1.9 million. Next month, as the original agreements expire, you will be asked to decide whether the city should continue to operate its hydroelectric project or not. The Water Bureau, Hydro Bureau, and City Attorney's Office will make a concerted effort to ensure that you are fully briefed on all aspects of the hydroelectric project, including the financial risks and public benefits that you may wish to consider before you make that decision. But let me be clear. Today, you are not being asked to decide whether the city should continue to operate its hydro plants. Instead, you are being asked to approve an intergovernmental agreement to maintain the plants, which must be done whether the city decides to continue to generate power or not. As you know, the city's primary source of drinking water is the Bull Run watershed, which includes 2 dams. During the national energy crisis of the mid-1970s, Council directed the Water Bureau to develop the Bull Run dams for power generation. In 1979, the Bureau of Hydroelectric Power was established by ordinance to manage the construction and operation of the city's hydro facilities. The Hydro Bureau operates under the direction of the Water Bureau, but it is not ratepayer funded. It is a general fund bureau, which means for the last 35 years, the general fund has carried some risk related to the hydro project. Since 1982, the city has owned a hydro plant at the dams. It has been operated by PGE under terms that were financially favorable to the city. PGE could offer favorable terms in part because it was already operating other dams in the region and had the workforce in place to operate the city's plant without much added expense. And since PGE was also purchasing the power from the city, marketing costs were lower. In the perfect world, PGE would continue to both operate the hydro plant and purchase the power that it generated. However, in late 2015, PGE informed the city that it was not seeking to renew its contract to operate the plants, which expires August 31st. Understanding that the city faced a decision about whether to continue operating this facility, Commissioner Fish directed staff to hire an expert consultant and outside legal counsel to ensure full and thoughtful consideration of the city's options, including whether and how the city could continue producing power in the watershed. So what is before council today is relatively straightforward. This intergovernmental agreement with Energy Northwest is necessary to maintain and safely operate the hydro plant, which must be attended to whether or not it is used, at least in the near term. This is why the IGA is coming to you in advance of the policy decision. If you decide to approve of the continued operation of the Portland Hydroelectric Project and the marketing of power generated, this IGA would allow Energy Northwest to run the physical operation for the next 5 years. If you decide not to continue the hydro project, the plant still must be maintained until the city surrenders its license to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which could take 6 months to a year. Otherwise, the city will be in violation of its license and subject to federal civil penalties. That is why it's critical to approve the IGA. Finally, it is important for you to know that approving this IGA with Energy Northwest for the operation and maintenance of the hydro project will not result in expenditures from the general fund prior to your decision as to whether to approve of the continued generation and sale of power. Should you decide not to continue the project, the city will have access to a Portland Hydroelectric Project Fund of $1.9 million to fulfill its maintenance duties until the project is officially shut down with its FERC obligations. In summary, today you are being asked to approve an agreement with Energy Northwest that will provide for essential maintenance of the city's hydro plants, separate and apart from council's ultimate decision to approve of its continued operation. Without an operator, the city's hydro plants cannot be maintained in accordance with its FERC license, nor will the city have the ability to continue its generation and sale of hydropower, should council choose to pursue that endeavor. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have concerning this
I
agreement.
just have a compliment. Commissioner Fish, that is the most thorough answer I have ever received to a question I've asked before the Portland City Council. That was excellent. Thank you.
Well, Mayor, I want to compliment Karen because she's really been our go-to lawyer on a lot of issues. And what we learned following the last hearing is that because this bureau gets so little attention and operates sort of in the distance with a lot of attention, we had made some assumptions about the sort of public's awareness of what all the issues were. And we thought it was important, before the council's asked to take this action, that we go back and tell the complete story, and that we make sure that people understand that this is in fact a general fund bureau, that the Water Bureau simply performs the ministerial function of overseeing it, that it has operated at risk to the general fund from the get-go, that the profits have been returned to the general fund, which is the upside, the $14 million. And as we'll discuss next month, when we come to you with the other contracts, including a price agreement with PGE, we'll be able to better quantify for you the risks and benefits of continuing with this operation or not. And you will have all the information you need to ultimately make the decision, green light or red light, as to whether we continue hydropower operations. For purposes of today, as Karen has, I think, very clearly explained, we have a regulatory requirement to operate this plant. It is in our watershed. We have to have a professional operator. There is no risk to the general fund, and this action would need to be taken regardless of whether we continue the hydropower operations.
Great.
And I
Karen-
appreciate the questions which we had since the last hearing, because it helped inform this presentation.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Commissioner Fish. And Karen, that was so succinct. Could I get a copy of that by email? Because there's a couple
By
of
email,
people
sure.
who've been inquiring of me about this, and I'd love to be able just to send them your statement. It's very illustrative, and I appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
I have
Commissioner
one
Daly.
question. I was listening very carefully. You may have answered it, but I missed it. So I understand that we'll either contract with Energy Northwest for 5 years of actually operating and producing energy, or we may opt to shut it down, in which case we'd have to still maintain it for 6 months to a year. But if we made that decision, we'd not be obligated to pay for the duration of that 5-year contract?
No, the contract has a 6-month notice period, so the most you'd be liable for is 6 months of operation, and we would go beyond that. And while it's a big number, it's a service contract, and we only pay for work done.
Great.
I appreciate what Mike just said, because of course there was a cost of maintaining it under the old arrangement. And again, I regret that. I think this has been a productive exercise for all of us, council, the Bureau, our legal team, and others in not assuming a foundation of understanding around something like this. And in fairness, given all the other regulatory issues we're dealing with, I don't know that we laid the foundation for this conversation as strongly as we could, and Karen has now, I think, done a marvelous job laying out the basic information. Colleagues, first let's see if anyone wants to testify on this, then I have a request.
We took testimony on this on the 5th, so I didn't have to sign it.
So Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to put an emergency clause on this, and I'll just read the following statement. The amendment that I would offer is as follows. The council declares that an emergency exists to allow continuous and uninterrupted operation of the city's hydroelectric project in compliance with its FERC license. and therefore this ordinance shall be in full force and effect from and after its passage by council.
Second.
So we have a motion on the table from Commissioner Fish, a second from Commissioner Saltzman. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Please call the roll on the amendment.
Saltzman,
Aye.
Udaly,
Aye.
Fish,
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. To the main motion, is there any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Saltzman,
Well, I appreciate this discussion. Look forward to further discussions about the future of the Bureau of Hydroelectric Power. I'll tip my hand a little bit. I don't know why we wouldn't want to continue to generate carbon-free electricity. That seems like a good idea in this time and climate. Aye.
Udaly,
Aye.
Fish.
Thank you, colleagues, for this discussion. Thank you to the director and our esteemed attorney for their presentation. And Dan, I don't want to tip my hand either, but I think there's a compelling argument to continue to generate clean energy, not the least of which is we've invested $55 million in this plant. What I think the council may want to focus on, though, is how we mitigate any risks that come up in the operation, since the markets for this kind of energy are somewhat unpredictable. I think you will be pleased when we come back to council with some recommendations by the Bureau to mitigate our downside risk. And I also think it may be time for us to consider, in lieu of sending any profit to the general fund, putting any proceeds from this Bureau into a separate fund to be used, in effect, for the rainy days that may occur in the future. But we can have that conversation. Thanks to my colleagues and to the Bureau for its presentation. Aye.
Wheeler.
So Commissioner Fish just hit the nail on the head for me. Obviously, I support this contractual piece, and I'm persuaded that it is a requirement of FERC that we continue to do this, and it's the responsible thing to do today. So yes, but I am interested in the risk mitigation part of this conversation. That will be something of great importance to me. And while I do not consider myself an expert on energy pricing, there is a lot of dynamism to that market right now, and we're seeing prices continue to drop. On the positive side, obviously, as an aside, renewable energy is becoming very much more competitive, which is a good thing given our city's objectives around renewable energy. But I look forward to that conversation next month, and I appreciate the clarity which you brought to the discussion today. It answered a number of my questions, and Commissioner and Karen and Mike, I thought you guys did a great job of answering those questions so far today. Thank you. The ordinance is adopted. We're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.